Dawn shivered behind the mountains, while the valley held its breath. Wind crawled through thorn hedges and rattled shutters like a warning with teeth. Lyra stood barefoot on the frost rim of the well, skirts torn, hair a wild halo. She was 17 and stubborn as winter. The earth had muttered all night, a low stone voice that only she seemed to hear. Elder Bram hobbled across the square, cloak patched, eyes bright with worry. Elder Bram said, "Child," the stream fell silent. Lyra said, "It is not silence, it is holding." Chickens fussed in their coops and would not step into the pale light. Far above, the glacier's blue ribs glowed like a bruise. Lyra said, "The mountain is dammed by rotten ice." Elder Bram said, "We prayed for water and now fear the flood." Doors opened and faces leaned out, thin from a hungry year. Lyra touched the well-stones and felt a pulse run beneath them. Lyra said, "Call the bell, wake every house." Elder Bram said, "They will not trust rags and omens." Lyra said, "They will trust the ground breaking." A hawk turned once over the ridge and vanished. Somewhere, a lamb cried, then another. The village had the sound of a match held too close to tinder. Elder Bram lifted the bell rope with shaking hands and found courage in the weight. The bell's voice shook soot from rafters and sent crows up in a ragged cloud. Villagers gathered in coats that remembered better years. Lyra stood small and fierce beside the well, the frost thinning under her feet. Elder Bram said, "Speak plain so even fear can follow." Lyra said, "The high ice has dammed the melt and will break at noon." A murmur rolled the crowd like wind in barley. A miller spat into the dust and hid his shaking hands. Lyra said, "We must cut a spill before the sun lifts. We must move the herds to the east rise. We must pull the sluice gate at the mill." A mother clutched her baby and measured the sky. Elder Bram said, "Who knows the old cuts?" Lyra said, "My mother walked them before the fever. I remember the turns." A boy no older than 12 hopped from foot to foot and nodded too fast. Elder Bram said, "You lead, and I answer for you." Lyra said, "Then tie a rope and bring 3 good shovels." The mountain groaned again, a long stone yawn. The crowd leaned toward the ridge, without meaning to. The day brightened as if to hurry them. They split like water seeking channels. Men hauled shovels and ropes, women drove sheep toward the east rise, children carried stakes like banners. Lyra ran point on the ridge path, Elder Bram steady behind her. Elder Bram said, "Your mother would scold me for letting you lead." Lyra said she would run ahead and dare us to keep up. Pines leaned into the wind and released old snow in ghostly sighs. The path narrowed to a spine with air on both sides. The glacier loomed near enough to taste iron. Lyra said, "We cut at the saddle and aim for the dry gulch." Elder Bram said, "Pray the gulch remembers being a river." A raven flapped alongside, black against blue ice. Lyra's feet found the notches her mother once kicked into the slope. She felt that old hand in the small of her back guiding each step. Elder Bram said, "If the dam goes, the mill will not stand." Lyra said, "Then we give the flood a kinder path." The ridge answered with a crack like splitting timber. At the saddle, the world opened into glare and breath. The dam was a dirty wall of ice, studded with rocks and winter's trash. Beneath it, the melt pressed like a trapped animal. Lyra knelt and pressed her ear to the crust. Lyra said, "It pushes here and here." Elder Bram said, "We notch where it begs and guide it to the gulch." They planted stakes, ran rope lines, and set 3 shovels to bite. Steel rang on ice and sent sparks of frost into the air. A younger farmer named Sen wiped his nose and tried to grin. Sen said, "If we live, I owe you a sheep." Lyra said, "If we do not, spend it well now." The first notch spat slush and hissed. Lyra widened it with a pick that had been her mother's. Elder Bram said, "Hold steady when it takes." Lyra said, "I was born holding steady." A hairline fisher wrote a quick story across the wall and paused, deciding. The sun climbed a finger. The mountain listened with both ears. The fisher chose and the dam spoke in a voice that emptied chests. Water punched through the notch and shredded into white veils. Lyra leaned into the rope and kept the cut honest. Elder Bram rode his shovel like a plow and turned the force toward the dry gulch. Sen slipped and was dragged knee-deep before Lyra hauled him by the collar. Sen said, "I will name the sheep after you." Lyra said, "Name it after if you must." The stream found the old bed with a joyous snarl. Far below, the mill wheel shuddered awake and threw light like a blessing. Lyra said, "Signal the rise." Elder Bram waved his cloak and whooped like a boy. Across the valley, women pushed the last of the flock onto higher ground. The cut widened itself and settled into purpose. The glacier sighed and let go without rage. Lyra stood, soaked and shaking, and laughed until she cried. Elder Bram said, "Ruin missed the road today." Lyra said, "Then we closed the door behind it." The bell in the village rang once for thanks. The village did not sleep that night. Fires burned low but steady, and voices rose in small knots outside doorways. Lyra sat by the well, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the cold, watching the stars sink behind the ridge. Elder Bram joined her with 2 mugs of nettle tea, his breath fog curling in the moonlight. Elder Bram said, "We bought time, not safety." Lyra said, "Time is the only thing worth buying." Somewhere far up the valley, a crack rolled like distant thunder. The sheep bleated uneasily, pressed close in their pen. Lyra's hands were raw from rope burns, her nails lined with ice. Elder Bram said, "Tomorrow, we ride to warn the river towns." Lyra said, "You mean I ride?" Bram smiled without humor. "They will listen to the girl who broke the dam more than an old man with too many stories." Lyra said, "Then I ride." The wind shifted, bringing the clean scent of meltwater and the faint promise of thaw. But beneath it, a colder smell lingered, as if the mountains still held something back. At dawn, the sky was a pale bruise, heavy with the weight of weather not yet decided. Lyra saddled the village's fastest mare, a rangy gray with a white blaze. Elder Bram tightened the cinch and patted the horse's neck. Elder Bram said, "The path will ice before noon. Take the lower trail by the aspen grove." Lyra said, "And if the river swells before I reach them?" Bram said, "Then shout and keep shouting." Villagers gathered silently to watch, some clutching charms, others whispering prayers. Sen limped forward and pressed a small pouch into her palm. Sen said, "Dried apples, for the road." Lyra managed a smile and tucked it away. The mare stamped once, eager to move. Lyra swung into the saddle, her skirt whipping in the wind. She looked back only once, to see the whole of the village framed in the square, holding its breath. Then she leaned forward and kicked into a gallop, hooves ringing sharp against the frozen earth. The lower trail wound through black pines and open meadows crusted with frost. Lyra's breath plumed behind her, mixing with the mare's. The river kept to her right, a cold mirror under the dim sun. She heard it before she saw it, the rush of water swollen beyond its banks. Around the next bend, the current churned, ice floes spinning like blades. Lyra slowed and scanned the far shore where smoke rose from the first river town. She said aloud, "Hold, just hold." A branch cracked behind her and she spun to see a stag, antlers heavy with frost, staring without fear. For a moment, the world narrowed to them, beast and girl, both measuring what came next. Then the stag turned, trotting back into the trees. Lyra touched her heels to the mare and rode on. She reached the river town as the bells began to toll. Men and women poured from narrow streets, faces sharp with worry. Lyra rode straight to the square, pulling the mare up hard. The mayor, a broad man with a fur-lined coat, stepped forward. Mayor said, "Who rings for flood in winter?" Lyra said, "The glacier above has broken once. It will break again before thaw." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The mayor's eyes narrowed. Mayor said, "We have walls against the river." Lyra said, "The river will bring the mountain with it." Her voice cut clean through the noise. The mayor glanced at the sky, then nodded to his men. Sound the high alarm. Rouse the next town. Lyra exhaled, her shoulders dropping for the first time since she left. The warning traveled faster than the river. By midday, Lyra rode with 2 riders from the town, their cloaks snapping in the wind. Snow began to fall in thin veils, catching in lashes and mans. The lead rider pointed to the west where clouds piled like dark fortresses. Rider said, "That's coming for us." Lyra said, "Then we keep ahead." Hooves hammered frozen ground, the sound swallowed by the growing wind. They passed farms where doors banged in the gusts, and smoke fled sideways from chimneys. At one bend, Lyra looked back and saw the river climbing its own banks, water dark with soil and branches. She gritted her teeth and leaned low over the mare's neck. Elder Bram's voice echoed in her head, "Time is the only thing worth buying." By the time they reached the 3rd town, snow had thickened into sheets, turning the road into a pale ribbon between dark fields. The riders were stiff with cold, their cloaks rimmed in ice. Lyra's hands ached on the reins, but she did not slow. The town's gates creaked open just enough to let them through. Inside, the streets were nearly empty, the few who remained darting indoors at the sight of strangers. A guard led them to a low hall, where the hearth burned hot, steam rising from their damp clothes. The captain of the guard, a sharp-eyed woman with graying hair, studied them in silence before saying, "You ride ahead of trouble." Lyra said, "It will be here by nightfall." The captain's gaze flicked to the storm outside. "Then we will move before it arrives." The captain's orders moved through the town like sparks on dry grass. Men and women began loading carts, children clutching blankets and bread. Lyra stood by the mare, rubbing warmth into its neck, while her companions secured provisions. One villager approached, a thin boy carrying a bundle of arrows. Boy said, "If they come from the pass, these are tipped to pierce fur." Lyra nodded, unsure if the boy knew what danger truly approached. As they set out again, the townsfolk streamed toward the southern road, carts creaking, hooves crunching in the snow. Lyra glanced at the captain riding ahead, her shoulders squared against the wind. Midday brought them to the edge of the pass, where cliffs rose sheer and white, their tops lost in cloud. The wind screamed between the walls of rock, flinging snow in blinding swirls. The captain raised a hand, halting the group. Lyra rode up beside her. Captain said, "If the ice shelf above goes, it will crush this road." Lyra scanned the ridges and saw dark fractures running through the snowpack. She said, "Then we cross before the mountain decides for us." The captain gave the signal, and the column moved forward at a trot, the sound of hooves echoing like drum beats in the frozen air. Halfway through the pass, a deep crack split the air. Lyra's heart seized as she looked up to see part of the ice shelf shifting. Shouts rose from the rear as snow dust rained down. The captain barked, "Ride!" Lyra pressed her heels to the mare, the animal lunging forward, hooves slipping on the icy ground. Behind them, a wall of snow sheared away, tumbling toward the road with a sound like tearing cloth. The wind from its fall hit them first, icy and sharp. They burst from the shadow of the cliffs just as the avalanche thundered down, sealing the pass behind them. They did not stop until the sound of the avalanche faded into the distance. Lyra slowed the mare, turning in the saddle to see nothing but a wall of fresh snow where the road had been. The captain rode up beside her, breathing hard. Captain said, "We'll take the long way around. It will cost us days." Lyra said, "We may not have days." The captain studied her, then nodded toward the south. "Then we ride through the lowlands and pray the river towns hold." They pushed on. The flat land ahead stretching into mist, the storm chasing them like a living thing. The lowlands were a maze of frozen marsh and half-buried willow stands. Hooves splashed through shallow pools hidden under thin ice, each crack sounding too loud in the still air. Lyra kept the mare tight behind the captain, eyes scanning for the darker shapes of hidden water. In the distance, a cluster of farmsteads huddled together, their roofs bowed under snow. The captain slowed as they approached, raising a hand to signal caution. A single figure emerged from the largest barn, a man wrapped in patched wool, carrying a pitchfork as though it were a spear. He called out, "Strangers don't ride this way unless chased." Lyra said, "Then you know why we're here." The farmer's warning carried urgency. He had seen the river rise twice in his lifetime, but never in winter. He led them to the loft where they could see the far tree line. Between the trunks, water shimmered black and restless. "It's already moving fast," he said. The captain gave the order to evacuate, but the farmer hesitated. "We've no carts left, lost them last thaw." Without missing a beat, Lyra said, "We'll carry what matters on horseback. The rest will be here when you return." She did not mention it might not be. Soon, the farmstead emptied into the road, a dozen riders with children clinging tight, turning toward the southbound trail. They moved in single file along a ridge that kept them above the marsh. The storm broke overhead, not with snow but sleet, each shard stinging exposed skin. Lyra pulled her hood low and leaned forward into the wind. Behind her, a child began to cry, the sound carried away before it could echo. The captain called back, "Keep together." Through the haze, they spotted another column approaching from the east. Survivors from a village they hadn't yet reached. Faces were pinched and pale, clothes stiff with frost. Lyra counted twice as many as the ridge could safely hold, but there was no other path. As the two groups merged, the ridge groaned under the weight. Lyra's mare slipped once, catching herself just short of the edge where ice crumbled into black water. The captain rode ahead, urging the pace, but the storm thickened, turning the world to a shifting wall of gray. Shapes loomed and vanished, trees, half-fallen fences, the occasional glint of water beneath thin ice. Lyra's fingers were numb, her shoulders locked against the cold. Somewhere behind her someone shouted, but the sound was lost in the wind. They pressed on, the ridge narrowing, until at last the sleet thinned enough to reveal a low rise ahead, crowned with dark pines. They reached the pines just before nightfall, the wind dying as if cut by the dense canopy. The ground here was dry, the snow thin and powdery. Fires sprang up quickly, smoke threading through the branches. Lyra sat close to the flames, holding her hands out until the sting faded from her fingers. The captain crouched beside her, eyes on the flickering light. Captain said, "You've brought more through this storm than I thought possible." Lyra said, "We're not through yet." Somewhere beyond the trees, the river kept its slow, dark work, pressing against its banks as if testing their resolve. Morning came pale and brittle, frost glittering on every branch. The camp moved quickly, leaving nothing but faint depressions in the snow. Lyra rode ahead with the captain, scanning the horizon for signs of the river. They crested a low hill and saw it, black water spread far beyond its banks, swallowing fields and fences. The current churned with uprooted trees, ice slabs spinning like blades. The captain muttered, "It's faster than I feared." Lyra said, "If we cross now we risk losing half the people." The captain's silence was answer enough. They would have to ride the river's edge until they found higher ground. The trail along the river was treacherous, often forcing them through shallow floodwater where ice cracked beneath the horses' hooves. Lyra's mare shied twice, ears pinned back at the hiss of moving water. The air smelled of mud and rot beneath the sharp cold. They passed the remains of a hamlet, its roofs barely visible, above the rising tide. A lone dog barked from the safety of a half-submerged hayloft, its voice hoarse and desperate. One rider tried to coax it down, but the captain said, "No time. We save who we can." Lyra kept her eyes forward, jaw tight. Near midday the river narrowed between two bluffs, the ground rising enough to offer safety. The captain signaled a halt, and they dismounted to rest the horses. Lyra stood at the bluff's edge, watching the water foam below. It was here she saw the first signs of pursuit, a column of riders far upriver, their dark shapes moving steadily toward them. She told the captain, who only said, "Then we move again, and faster." Word spread quickly, and the camp's quiet turned to urgent motion, every hand helping to pack and saddle. They left the bluff at a gallop, the riders behind them closing the distance with every mile. Lyra could hear the pounding of their hooves even above the river's roar. The trail narrowed through a stand of frost-crusted birch, branches whipping against her shoulders. The mare's breath steamed in great clouds as they pushed hard, her hooves finding slick purchase on frozen earth. Once, a child's muffled cry made Lyra glance back. Their pursuers were close enough now for her to see the flash of steel in their hands. She urged the mare faster, the birch trunks blurring into streaks of white and gray. The forest opened suddenly into a wide, snow-swept meadow. The captain raised her arm, signaling the group to split, half veering west toward the hills, the rest, including Lyra, riding south toward the river's bend. Their pursuers hesitated, then followed both trails, splitting their own force. Lyra risked a glance at the sky. Clouds were building fast, heavy with more snow. She knew if they could reach the bend before the storm hit, they might lose the riders in the whiteout. Tightening her grip, she leaned forward, feeling the mare's muscles bunch beneath her like coiled springs. The wind rose in sudden violent gusts, flattening the grass beneath the snow, and whipping loose flakes into stinging clouds. Lyra's mare fought against the force, head tossing, but she kept her heels firm and her hands steady. The river bent sharply ahead, its far bank lost in the thickening white. The captain's group had vanished west, leaving only the muted thunder of their hooves fading into the distance. Behind, the enemy riders were shadows in the storm, shapes that blurred and reappeared with the shifting snow. Lyra said under her breath, "Keep running. Just keep running." The snow became a curtain, falling so heavily that Lyra could barely see the rider directly ahead. The group slowed to keep from losing one another, hooves muffled under the deepening drifts. Somewhere to their right, the river groaned, ice shifting under unseen pressure. A sharp crack rang out, followed by the slow grinding roar of a break. Lyra's heart hammered. If the ice gave way, the river's current would pull anything nearby under. She called to the others, "Stay close to the tree line," and led them toward the shadow of pines where the snow was shallower. They found momentary shelter under the trees, but the storm still raged beyond the branches. The air was filled with a constant hiss as snow sifted down through the needles. Lyra dismounted to check her mare's legs for ice buildup, fingers aching as she broke away frozen clumps. One of the younger riders asked, "Will they still follow in this?" Lyra glanced back toward the white void beyond the trees. "If they can see us, they will." Her voice was flat, not from lack of hope, but from knowing how desperate their pursuers were. When they emerged from the pines, the meadow beyond had transformed. Snow covered their old tracks entirely, leaving the ground a smooth, untouched expanse. Lyra seized the chance, turning the group sharply east away from the river. The wind howled across the open space, pushing against them like a living thing. Her mare lowered her head and drove forward through the drifts. In the distance, a low ridge appeared, its slope dark with bare shrubs. If they reached it, they could follow its spine and vanish into the folds of the land. They gained the ridge just as the storm reached its height, the air so thick with snow it felt like wading through water. The world narrowed to the space between her mare's ears and the dark blur of the rider ahead. When they finally stopped, the pursuers were gone, lost to distance or swallowed by the white. Lyra exhaled, the breath steaming in the still air beneath the ridge's shelter. No one cheered. They were alive, but the river was still ahead, and every mile closer to home meant the danger was not yet over. Dawn broke weak and pale, the storm having passed in the night. The ridge was coated in a smooth crust of ice, the valley below glittering in the thin light. Lyra rose stiffly, her muscles aching from the cold and the ride. The captain's group had rejoined them under cover of darkness, bringing news that the village still stood, though the river threatened its outskirts. Lyra listened in silence, knowing every hour mattered. The captain said, "If we ride hard, we reach it before nightfall." Lyra nodded once, her eyes fixed on the shimmering horizon. The ride down the ridge was tense, the path slick with frozen runoff. More than once, a horse stumbled, but no one fell. The land opened into rolling hills, each one revealing more of the valley below. By midday they saw smoke curling from chimneys, signs of life. Relief rippled through the group, But Lyra's gaze was drawn to the river, swollen and dark, pressing dangerously close to the village's edge. She quickened her pace, the mare's breath clouding in the chill air. The captain kept glancing at the water, calculating silently. They reached the outskirts to find villagers already at work, stacking sandbags and dragging supplies uphill. The air was alive with shouts and the steady slap of water against makeshift barriers. Lyra swung down and joined a line passing heavy sacks from cart to wall. A boy no older than 12 grinned at her and said, "You made it back." She answered, "We weren't going to let the river win." Her arms ached, but she worked faster, matching the rhythm of those beside her. Every barrier they raised bought another moment of safety. The river surged again in the afternoon, waves slopping over the lower bags. Men and women scrambled to brace the wall, some knee-deep in icy water. Lyra hauled another sack, her boots filling with freezing mud. A loud crack split the air as a section of the barrier gave way. She ran toward it without thinking, throwing herself against the gap as others shoved more bags into place. The cold bit through her clothes, but she held until the wall was solid again. When she stepped back, the captain met her eyes and gave a brief nod, no words needed. By nightfall, the worst had passed. The river's rise slowed, its surface still churning, but no longer creeping higher. Fires burned along the main street, casting warm light over weary faces. Lyra stood apart for a moment, watching the glow reflect off the wet cobbles. She thought of the ride, the storm, the shadowed figures that had pursued them, and of how close they'd come to losing everything. The captain approached and said quietly, "You saved them." Lyra shook her head. "We all did." Above them the stars emerged, sharp and clear in the cold night sky.